Okay. It's kind of neat to see the programs that they have available at different universities. I did something fairly similar to that when I was at Dalhousie. Not the same setup, but it was under the guise of a co-op thing. And it was through biology, not psych, but I was able to work every other semester while I was in school, and it allowed me to sort of get some hands-on experience, and I very quickly learned the stuff that I enjoyed versus the stuff that I really did not enjoy. So something like that can be really useful. But it's also kind of nice to talk about getting some hands-on experience with research, especially where my intent for today is to just spend a little bit of time talking about the practical uses of operant conditioning. So I think I've mentioned this before. This is the kind of research that I have experience with. This is what I've done in my lab, and I'll talk about some of the research that either I've done or other colleagues have done through the lab. But this isn't something that I'm going to be testing you specifically on. We're going to be employing some of our operant conditioning techniques, but I'm not going to ask you about chickadees specifically. I'm not going to ask you specifically about any of the content of this lecture. This is just meant to be sort of a review of some terms, but also maybe something a little bit interesting, looking at actual research that's been done using the stuff we've talked about in class. So in case you're not familiar with them, these are our study organisms in the lab. These are black-capped chickadees. So they are very small North American songbirds. They're about 10 to 12 grams. Sometimes we get really chubby ones and they're like 14, but still they're about this big. And they are small balls of rage. They will attack you relentlessly. So they're always interesting to interact with. But we care about them because they're songbirds. And songbirds are a pretty wide group of all of the bird species. It's about half of known bird species. And they're interesting because they're what we call vocal learners. And so humans are also vocal learners. What that means is we aren't born knowing all of our vocalizations. We have to learn them over time by interacting with models and by communicating with others of our own species. So same thing with chickadees. They're not born knowing how to sing. They have to listen to models. They have to listen to other chickadees in order to figure out what they're supposed to sound like. And we can actually do research where when we see chickadees who've been raised in isolation, they may end up producing strange songs, or they might not be able to produce certain sounds or frequencies. And just like humans, where we have sort of a critical period where it's really important that we learn language while our brains are sort of set up to absorb that information, the chickadees have that same window where they have to be exposed to that sort of specific kinds of sounds during a specific period, or else their vocalizations are always going to sound weird. And so we care about them because not many species can do this, where they adjust their vocalizations in order to sound like the rest of their species. So we have it in chickadees. We see it also in parrots, so another group outside of songbirds. I think we've also found it in hummingbirds, elephants, and pinnipeds, so like whales and dolphins and stuff like that, as well as seals, but those are kind of it. So like dogs and cats, they would come knowing most of their core vocalizations. So we focus in on vocal learners to see if we can figure out something about the process of learning. So whenever we're applying for grants or something, because psychology research really prioritizes how this applies to humans, we can say, hey, well, these guys learn language the same way that chickadees do, or the same way that humans do. So maybe this helps us get some understanding of how humans learn too. So that's our sort of side connection to human research. But we've asked all sorts of different kinds of research questions, and I've kind of mentioned a couple of them before in class. One of the easiest ones was just asking if the chickadees can tell the difference between male and female produced vocalizations. So if we give them a whole bunch of male calls and a whole bunch of female calls, can they tell the difference? We've also looked at, they have different kinds of vocalizations. So they have sort of two broad categories: songs, things that are used mostly for mating, and then calls are things that are used mainly for everything else. And usually you have very simple calls and very complex songs to try and impress a potential mate. But chickadees do it the opposite way. where they have really complex calls and very simple songs. So we've done some testing on that too, just what can they learn about their different vocalizations. Another really interesting one that I don't know if it's been quite accepted yet for publication, but we were looking at basically, do the chickadees treat the predator or the calls of chickadees exposed to predators the same as the calls of those predators themselves? So for chickadees, one of the scariest predator they can face is a saw-whet owl. They're about this big, but they're small and maneuverable, so they can catch chickadees really well. Chickadees don't really care about bigger owls because they're too slow to grab a chickadee, and they usually leave them alone. So if we give the chickadees or show them a saw-whet owl mount or let them hear a saw-whet owl song or call, will they react the same way as to an alarm call produced by a chickadee that saw a saw-whet owl? And really coolly, the answer is kind of yes. There's a little bit of crossover there where they will show the same level of overall arousal to scarier, meaning smaller predators, that they do to larger predators. And then most recently, towards the end of my degree, I started looking at anthropogenic noise and whether it interferes with their ability to discriminate between different sounds, and if it changed their behavior by sort of interfering with their perceptual abilities. But as you can tell from a lot of this discussion, or maybe you have picked up on it, we're using the term discriminate quite a bit here. So most of my research was focusing on discriminations. But as part of that, because as we've said, sort of discrimination and generalization go hand in hand, depending on how you frame something. So if you're discriminating between two different things, so you're saying, okay, can you tell the difference between male and female calls? Okay, so we're saying, can you tell that difference? Can you discriminate? Can you put them in separate categories? But we would also probably be asking if you generalize that response to all male calls or all female calls. So we can look at it from both directions. So we can ask, can you tell the difference? But can you also treat the ones that are the same the same? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can set that up. Because I've hinted at this before, when you work with non-human animals, it is very, very difficult to ask a direct question. Instead, we have to rely on they would behave in this particular way if they have this particular understanding. And so what we would look at in our male versus female calls is, okay, let's think about categorization. Let's think about treating similar stimuli the same, generalizing to similar stimuli, and discriminating between dissimilar stimuli. So we have to operate on, okay, well, if these chickadees form a mental sort of category of male calls and a separate mental category of female calls, then we should see discrimination between those vocalizations and generalization within. And then if we don't see that, if we don't see that they can tell the difference between them, if we don't see that they treat them separately, then we might say that they have a category that is all calls fall into one category and we can't divide it up. So we would have predictions on their behavior based on how they sort of store that information. Okay, so how do we set this up? And I'm going to stick with the male versus female idea because it's sort of one of the easier of our concepts to grasp. And we use a process called differential reinforcement. And I kind of hinted that differential something is a term that we use fairly often. But with differential reinforcement, we're basically saying that one category of stimuli are reinforced and another category is not. So we have differences in reinforcement depending on what we show to the birds. So for most of our things, we use, if we have a, say, good category, if we want the birds to produce a response when they hear female calls, we will give them access to food when those calls are played. So that's rewarded or reinforced. We would then have non-rewarded or non-reinforced for male calls. So that would be the bad category. And instead of getting access to food, the lights would turn out. So by having that differential reinforcement, they're encouraged to behave a particular way when one type or one category is played, and behave a different way when the other category is played. All right. And so with this, when we're having our categories, we're trying to get this idea that, okay, well, we assume that they can tell the difference between males and females. So we've made artificial categories where the female calls get food, the male calls get lights out. If the birds' mental categories match what we've put together, then we should see that they learn the whole setup a lot faster. Chickadees and other vocal learners have an unfortunate habit of being really good at memorizing things, especially things that are biologically relevant. So if you give them a bunch of chickadee calls, they'll actually memorize each individual call. So we get around this by using hundreds and hundreds of different calls. But these guys are very picky and will memorize if it's easier. So we've run into issues in the past where they would prefer to memorize than form categories. Just one of those things you learn after running a full experiment and then just realizing that memorizing's easier than categorization, which it shouldn't be. But they are very good at it. So the idea here is if we have enough stimuli to make it hard for them to memorize every single one, then having that category, having that concept of female calls get me food and male calls do not, then we should see them learn the process a lot faster. And so we can test this to see if, okay, are they actually learning that it's sort of male or female calls are good and male calls are bad by showing them new vocalizations they haven't heard before. So we would train them on, say, 200 calls. And once they've learned to tell the difference, we don't know if they've done it for memorizing or using categories, we introduce them to a new 200 calls from a different bunch of individuals. And we say, okay, how do you treat these new calls? Stuff you've never heard before. And if they still respond to the female calls like they're good and getting them food, and they still respond to the male calls like they're bad and the lights are going to turn out, then we would say, yeah, they've probably formed a category. And so we can also do, I don't know if I have a slide specifically for this, but this would be sort of we call them true category groups, where we set it up so that all of our reinforcement contingencies match the categories that we think the birds should be using. But we also set up a random control group where instead of having just the female calls rewarded and the male calls unrewarded, we would mix it up so that there's a random selection of female and male calls that's rewarded and a random selection of both that are unrewarded. And what that does is it just forces that group of birds to memorize because there is no logical category. So if they can't rely on a category, they have to memorize. So that's our second thing, where not only did we check if they transferred what they learned to new calls they'd never heard before, we also checked to see if our control group that had to memorize took longer to learn it than the category group did. Because theoretically, if you give them enough vocalizations, it should take them a lot more time and effort to memorize them all. So we would see differences in performance, whether they had a real category or whether we put them in the control group where they had to memorize. So we set these up with a bunch of different things because, again, from experience, it does not always go the way that you want it to go. So you very often are glad that you have the backup systems to check against. All right. And so far, I've kind of hand-waved what I've meant by responding, like it's operant conditioning. So they are producing some kind of response to these stimuli I've been talking about. But I haven't mentioned what the response is. And so with operant conditioning in practice, we typically see two different options. So responding can mean forced choice. This works a lot better with visual stimuli. It's kind of hard with audio stimuli. So forced choice would be you are shown two things and you have to pick the right one. So if instead of sort of male versus female, we had blue versus purple, and the blue one is the good category, then you should push the blue button and not the purple button. So that would be an operant response. If you push the purple button, you get food. So you should be more likely to push the purple button more often. But as I said, chickadees don't do very well with our visual stimuli and operant boxes. You can set it up, it's just a lot harder. So what we typically do is auditory stimuli, vocalizations. And it's really hard to show them two sounds. So you would have to do one at a time. And that's when we use the second option. So instead of giving them a choice, pick one or the other, we give them the option of either going, making a response, or not going, withholding a response. So instead of having both colors shown to you at once, you would only have one color shown. And if it's the, I think we said blue was the good one, so if blue shows up, then you would peck it. But if blue doesn't light up, then you don't peck it, so you make no response. So you respond to the ones that get you food, and you ignore the ones that don't get you food. And so, again, that's sort of the basic setup, but with our chickadees, we use go, no go, but we don't use buttons because they're not great at pecking. So instead, we get them to make a physical, like full body response. And I'm actually going to show you a visual of this and then a clip of it in action. So this is sort of a weird little cartoon of what it looks like inside one of our operant boxes. So this is a Skinner box, but set up for chickadees. So if you think of this here, we have a speaker covered in some mesh. So that's what this is here. So that's just where our sounds come from. So we can play whatever sounds that we want. And then that weird contraption in the middle, that's our feeder. And so it's set up so that there's a little red dot in the middle. That's our cue light. That light turns red when it's ready for a next trial. So it lets the birds know that if they start a trial, they have the chance of being reinforced. So that would be our discriminative stimulus in this situation. And so where the chickadee is sitting on that little perch there, that's actually set up with infrared beams. So that when the bird is there, it breaks the beams and it tells the computer that they're sitting in front of the speaker and they're ready to listen. And so when they do that, the computer will pick one vocalization from either the male or the female pools that we have, and it'll play it for the bird. And the bird has to stay on that perch and stay still, breaking that beam until they hear the whole call. We set it up so that if they leave early, we reset the trials. So we make them sit there so we know that they're listening. And then when they're done, they can choose to either go and make a response by hopping into the feeder, or they can no-go. They don't make a response, and they can go literally anywhere else in their enclosure. And so if we were saying that, okay, the female calls are the ones they get food for. So they hear a vocalization, it's a female, they hop into the feeder, and that little cup at the bottom will rise up and give them access to food. If they hear a male call and they hop into the feeder, then the lights turn out and they have to wait a couple of seconds to start again. If they make the correct response to a male call, they would just hop anywhere else in the cage. Maybe they go get a snack somewhere else. Maybe they go grab water. Maybe they go whatever. And then they can start over again. So they should learn that when you hear female calls, you go in the feeder. And when you hear male calls, you don't. And we can actually look at their rates of responding to see when they learn this, how well they learn this, and how their rate of learning compares to those birds who had to memorize. So if you think of this, when we start at the very beginning, you can't tell the birds that female calls are going to be reinforced. They have to figure it out through trial and error. So they're going to go into the feeder all the time. And sometimes the lights are going to stay on and they'll get food. Sometimes the lights turn off and they don't get food. And then they have to figure out what makes it different the times that I get food versus when I don't get food. And so that's our setup when we're looking at, okay, can they tell the difference between male and female calls? And if they can, we should see that they go into the feeder very, very often when they hear the female calls, and that they should avoid the feeder when they hear male calls. And for the most part, that is what we see. They're actually very good at learning discriminations, as I've mentioned before. We use like a 80% success rate. So if they respond to the good calls and avoid the bad calls at like an 80% rate, then we call them good. On simple discriminations, they can get up to almost 100% success rates. We do have a lot of interrupted trials. If you've ever seen chickadees in trees, they don't sit still for long. So these guys hop around the cage. They hop like 2 or 3 times a second sometimes. So they are constantly moving, which is why we force them to sit still to listen to the song. But that might raise the question of how? How do you convince a hyperactive bird to sit still long enough to hear a vocalization? And the answer is shaping. So another one of our concepts. So when we start with the birds in these boxes, they have no idea how they work. They have no idea where to get food. They have no idea anything. So the first week that we have them, we keep them in the box. They have a cup of food just like they do when they're in the colony rooms. And we have the feeder up all the way with a pile of food on top. So they know where everything is. They can recover. They don't like being moved. So we give them lots of time to just accommodate to the situation. They figure out that they get food from the feeder or from their cup. Then we take away the extra cup and they have to go to the feeder to get food. And we watch and make sure there's infrared sensors in there to make sure that we know that they're in the feeder. And then once they've figured that out, we say, okay, so now anytime you hop into the feeder, the food cup will rise and you get food. So it's not up all the time. It's only up when they're in the feeder. And then we will have it so that they can't go in all the time. They have to wait until our red light is on. If they hop in the feeder and the red light is on, nothing happens. But if the red light is on and they hop in the feeder, then the food cup rises and they get food. So we get to see that they hop in the feeder only when the light is on. Then we teach them that in order to turn that light on, they have to land on the perch where they will eventually hear the stimuli. So to turn the red light on, to allow the food cup to rise, they have to sit on that perch. And so once they do that, the light comes on, they hop in the feeder, they get their food. And then we make them stay on the perch for longer and longer periods of time. They can't just briefly touch it and then leave and still get food. Now they have to sit for a longer time. And we do this, it takes almost a month or more. Sometimes we have birds that are a little slower. And we make sure that they know at every step of the stage what's going on. So we slowly shape their behavior until we can have them sitting on that perch long enough to hear a stimulus as long as we need. And then we can expose them to our experimental stimuli. So we go through all of those processes. So it's kind of neat to see that, yeah, shaping does have a role in this sort of thing. And then we can use those concepts of discrimination and generalization to see what it is that they know. And after all of this, I've actually done a paper looking at their differences between calls and what the result is at the end. And the answer is that even with, I think I got up to like 400 or 500 stimuli for them to work with, they still preferred to memorize. When we worked with songs, the ones that are related to mating, you could have like 100 vocalizations, and they figured it out. They formed categories. The ones who were working with the true categories were faster. They learned it faster. They generalized to new stimuli. They did a great job. But as soon as we switched over to their calls, when they're sort of not sex related, all of a sudden they no longer care. So I ran the experiment twice to see if we could figure out what was going on. Actually, no, 3 times, because we had to increase the number of stimuli. So it took me like 4 years to figure out that they don't care. They can tell the difference, but they don't care to tell the difference. So it's very hard to force them to make categories. But they're more than capable of doing it with other vocalizations, just not the ones I was looking at. So one of those downsides of research where you might come to the end and go, okay, they should do this. The literature says they should do this. They do this in other cases. Other birds do this. These guys do not. So that was one of my conclusions that I had to defend in my PhD. But then the last thing that I wanted to show here is actually a video that goes through and illustrates what's going on inside the operant box. So I figured this might be neat to look at. So if you imagine where the red light is behind the feeder, so you're looking out into the enclosure, and then right in front of you is where the food cup rises, that's where we have a video camera in this situation. So we're looking at it from one side, and then let's see if I can... Actually, I'm going to do it this way because we only want like the last half of the video, because there's a whole bunch of text that doesn't really matter. Okay, so let me make sure that this is visible. Okay, hold on. Let me explain it before you start. Okay. So first thing we're going to see is a correct go response. I don't have the sound set up because I always find that sound goes weird in these rooms. So what we're going to see is the bird is going to land on the perch. We're not going to hear it, but the bird will hear it. There'll be a vocalization, and the bird is going to hop into the feeder. And then the food cup rises and they get food. And it happens very, very quickly. So we can look at that right here. So you can see him. He's going to settle in a second. There he is. He's sitting on that perch. So he would hear the sound. And then he gets his food. And he goes and he sticks it right in his water bottle because they like to cache. So they shove it in their water bottle for later, which is just one of those things. Next, we have a correct response to a no-go. So they would hear their male call. And so they sit, they hear it, and they choose to go somewhere else. They don't go into the feeder, so they just don't do anything, and that's the correct response. And so you'll see it again. He'll settle eventually on the perch. He's going to listen, and then he just goes and hangs out elsewhere. And then the last one are the quote-unquote punishment trials, where they go into the feeder and the light turns out. So same basic thing. So he's hearing a male call, and then he hops in the feeder, and then the light turns off. And that'll turn on again so that he could make another trial afterwards. So that's what we're looking at there in terms of what's going on. And I just find it kind of neat to actually see them moving and hopping and jumping like that, because they are very, very quick little creatures. But that's what I wanted to cover today, was just sort of an example of employing some of the terms we've talked about. And because we do have time, I basically wanted to give you guys the chance, if you have questions, to ask questions. And if not, then you can be gone and enjoy your weekend early. But I'm going to hang around for the next little while. And if you have any questions, we can go over stuff.